understand race, the only answer really I can come up with is that it doesn't understand race. That there's very little discussion about race in development research and development thinking. And there's a great difficulty, I think, in defining concepts of race and racism with various articulations of the meanings of race, focusing primarily around opposing demands of culture and biology, knowledge and power. And these have been well rehearsed, and I don't want to go into them here. But just to say that racial difference is identified by a variety of people in a variety of ways, of material, embodied, discursive, and social markers of difference and inequality. So meanings of race, then, are as multiple as the social context in which they have effect, and very importantly, are also spatial and temporal, because they come out of those social contexts. So I'm concerned then with linking historical, ideological and discursive constructions of race with institutional and material ones to show how meanings about race are open to many types of agency, from the individual to the organisational, but also from the local to the global. So race has shaped then systems of inclusion and exclusion, which are foundational to an understanding of development. So in development studies, post-colonial, postmodern, anti-development critics have provincialized the supposed universality of Western notions of development, and they've critiqued then the inability of the West to theorize non-Western experiences. And so we have subaltern studies, we have discourses of participation, of local knowledge, of bottom-up development rather than top-down development, who is the expert, who's indigenous and who's local, and there's some debate going on. Other research and writing has explored the relationship between feminism, post-colonialism and development, like Cheryl McEwen's work, or Jonathan Crush, who looks at colonial histories of development and contemporary representations of the Third World. And others have looked at institutional machinery, like Emma Crew and David Lewis. But all those accounts, and I've been part of producing those accounts, I think have to varying degrees alluded to race, but they've largely focused on talking about Eurocentrism. And I think that's another shift in our gaze, that they articulate those kinds of inequalities around a discourse of Eurocentrism rather than a discourse of race. And the ways in which ideas about race flow through development discourses are still rarely spoken about overtly. And when they have been, by Sarah White, for example, they haven't affected any serious interrogation of the discourse. Well, why is that? Because there is that literature there, even if it's not within development, it does exist in other social science disciplines that have been interrogated from a post-colonial perspective. Well, perhaps this is because, as Pieterse writes, race is seen as an almost empty, fluid and outdated category with little consensus about its meaning. Well, I think that's sort of opting out of really thinking about what it might mean and how it's manifest. So is the invisibility around race because it's considered relatively unimportant in shaping global inequities, injustice and poverty, while other categories of social differentiation, such as ethnicity, religion and culture, are perceived to have greater significance, although of course they all articulate race in some way or another. Perhaps within a discourse that's framed around humanitarianism, cooperation and aid, raising race is too distracting, disruptive and demanding. Or does the silence of race conceal the complicity of development with racialized projects? And I want to address these questions by throwing a spotlight on discourses of development and interrogating explanations of difference in terms of race. So explore then how analyses of race can contribute to understanding the causes, the consequences and the responses to problems of underdevelopment, and very importantly, to understanding global power and privilege. Just as a footnote here, I mean, clearly ideas of race are evidently not unique to the West. Ideologies, policies, and methodological approaches vary spatially, as do the individual sensibilities of the increasingly diverse range of people invoked in the development industry. Thus, although the focus here is on a racialized Eurocentrism in a way, it's not the intention, it's not my intention to suggest that there's a singular homogenized discourse of development, nor to deny the existence of dissenting voices. So I'm not trying to suggest that in all places and in all spaces that these kinds of discourses become embedded. But what I am suggesting is that in mainstream development, we can identify some kind of racialized project. So in terms of obscuring a colonial genealogy, much development work makes no mention of the colonial period, or indeed then makes no apology for it. And this ahistorical approach to development studies obscures then the multiple colonial genealogies of development, and very importantly, right, if you don't acknowledge that past, you can't identify continuities over time. The continuities of racialized ideologies, control, and representations. So how did colonial constructions of race flow into, become reshaped, adapted, reworked into the post-independence period? If you don't think that development studies has its roots in that colonial past, then clearly we're not going to be able to move forward in understanding how development can be racialized. And I teach in development studies, and every year, it's a postgraduate institute, and every year in the first lecture, it's an historical perspective on development. And the colonial period is sort of dealt with in one sentence, and then we say, right, development began in 1945 with the setting up of the Bretton Woods institutions. So much research and teaching in development studies embeds 1945 as the start date in which development was initiated with the establishment of those institutions. This limited historical analysis in much mainstream development studies, I think, reveals the largely unreflexive nature of the discipline. Because the discipline has a compulsion to look to targets and goals. So the Millennium Development Goals means that you have to look to 2015. It's a highly unreflexive discipline. It doesn't look back very easily. And with a few notable exceptions like Jonathan Crush or Jock Stirrett, most historical reviews of development, if you look at some of the Open University texts, or in fact any of the texts on development studies, they tend towards a compartmentalization of clearly bounded successive periods characterized by specific historical hegemonies that begin then, 1950s economic growth. I mean, I could repeat this, you know, with my eyes closed and in my sleep. It's been rehearsed so many times. But economic growth and modernization theory of the 60s, moving through theories of dependency, world systems, and culminating in neoliberalism, the Washington Consensus, the post-Washington Consensus. Or an alternative version to that kind of theoretical history is mapped onto particular events and processes, and I would call that a political economy trajectory that traces by decade the history of development from the golden years of the 1950s through import substitution, industrialization in the 60s and the early 70s, the debt crisis in the 70s, structural adjustment programs. I hope some of this is familiar to you, but that kind of continuous rehearsal of a particular history, which is repeated so often that it becomes like a mantra, then becomes the history of development. So effectively wiping out anything that happened before 1945 as having any implications for development. So we have a truncated, shortened vision or version of history and development that wipes out what happened before. Well, why does it conceal a colonial legacy? Well, that shortened version of history that dominates the discipline has been because of a perceived need to effectively distance development, thought and practice from the contemporary negativity that surrounds Britain's imperial history. And this is very evident from the colonial administrators' stories, because all of them said to me, I am atypical. You know, well, how many atypicals do you need before you have a typical? But everybody was atypical. Well, you thought I was doing that with the Mau Mau in Kenya, or you thought I was doing that in terms of land reform or collection of taxes. But actually, I was very interested in collectivization of farming and tools and machinery and agricultural development, etc. So there's a negativity that surrounds Britain's imperial history. So the concealment of a colonial past becomes part of a project that creates then and maintains a dichotomy. So it creates and maintains and embeds a dichotomy between a colonialism that is bad, exploitative, extractive, and oppressive, and a development which then has to be, because it's counterposed to colonialism, a development which is good, moralistic,